Don't let him drink that. The scream shattered the ballroom so violently that even the violinist missed a note. Crystal glasses paused midair. Conversations collapsed into silence. And for one strange heartbeat, every billionaire, investor, and politician inside the Grand Meridian Hotel turned toward the same person they hadn't noticed all night. A black waitress standing beside a shattered champagne tray. Naomi Carter's chest rose sharply as sparkling liquid spread across the marble floor beneath her sneakers. Her breathing was uneven. Not because she had dropped the tray. Because Ethan Whitmore was still holding the glass. The billionaire CEO stood at the center of the ballroom beneath a chandelier that looked like frozen lightning. 6'3". Tailored black tuxedo. Silver cufflinks that reflected the amber lights overhead. The kind of man magazines called untouchable. The kind of man people smiled at before he even spoke. And right now, he was staring directly at Naomi like she had lost her mind. Around him, the room vibrated with confusion. A woman in diamonds covered her mouth. Someone muttered, "What the hell is she doing?" Another guest laughed nervously. The orchestra had stopped completely now. All that remained was the faint hum of the rooftop air conditioning and the soft crackling sound of broken glass beneath Naomi's feet. Ethan slowly lowered the whiskey tumbler in his hand. "Excuse me," he said coldly. Naomi swallowed hard. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. She could smell it now. Bitter almonds. Faint. Almost invisible beneath the expensive whiskey. But not invisible enough. Not to her. A security guard immediately stepped forward. "Ma'am, you need to step away from the guests." Naomi barely heard him. Her eyes stayed fixed on the drink. The oversized ice sphere rotated slowly inside the crystal glass. Too slowly. Her stomach twisted. Something was wrong with it. Very wrong. Across the ballroom, cameras from local business reporters flashed against gold walls and towering windows overlooking Manhattan. Tonight was supposed to be historic. Ethan Whitmore's biotech company was hours away from closing a $4.2 billion merger with one of the largest pharmaceutical firms in America. The room was filled with money so old and powerful it barely needed introductions. And Naomi had just interrupted the biggest night of the year. "Sir," she said again, her voice shaking now, "please don't drink that." One of the executives scoffed loudly. "Jesus Christ. Somebody get her out of here." Another rolled his eyes. "Probably wants attention." Naomi felt every stare in the room pressing against her skin. She had felt those stares her whole life. The kind that looked through her instead of at her. Rich people usually never remembered the waitress. Unless she made a mistake. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Do you realize what kind of event this is?" His voice was calm, but sharp enough to cut glass. Naomi nodded once. "Yes, sir." "Then explain why you just caused a scene in front of half of Wall Street." Naomi opened her mouth, but the words caught in her throat. Because the truth sounded insane. Because nobody in this room would believe a black waitress over a billionaire CEO. And because deep down, she wasn't even fully sure why she knew what she knew. Only that every instinct inside her was screaming the same thing. Don't let him drink it. A drop of melted ice slid down the side of the glass. Naomi's eyes widened. Then she whispered the words that turned the entire ballroom cold. "I think somebody poisoned your drink." The silence that followed felt heavier than the Manhattan skyline outside the glass walls. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for a drink. They just stared at Naomi Carter as if the young waitress had dragged a thunderstorm into the middle of a billion-dollar celebration. Ethan Whitmore's expression hardened instantly. Not fear. Irritation. The kind of cold irritation powerful men develop after spending too many years being obeyed. "Poison," he repeated slowly. "Do you understand how insane that sounds?" Naomi felt her pulse hammering against her ribs. The security guard beside her reached carefully for her arm, but she stepped back before he could touch her. "Sir, I know it sounds crazy," she said quickly. "But something is wrong with the drink." One of the board members laughed under his breath. "This is unbelievable." Another guest whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Somebody is trying to go viral." The comments hit Naomi like tiny cuts. Familiar cuts. The kind she had learned to survive years ago. Because people in rooms like this rarely listen to women like her. Especially black women wearing aprons instead of designer gowns. Ethan slowly set the whiskey glass onto a nearby cocktail table. His movements were controlled, precise, almost surgical. "What exactly makes you think my drink is poisoned?" Naomi looked at the amber liquid again. The oversized ice sphere had developed faint cloudy streaks through the center. Tiny fractures that should not have been there yet. She could smell the sweetness beneath the oak and smoke. Bitter almonds. Her chemistry professor used to talk about it during late-night lab sessions at Hunter College before Naomi dropped out to take care of her mother. "The ice," she whispered. "Something is wrong with the ice." A few people rolled their eyes immediately. One woman in a silver gown folded her arms. "This is absurd." But Ethan did not speak right away. His sharp blue eyes stayed locked on Naomi's face, studying her. Noticing the sweat near her temples. The trembling fingers. The fact that she looked terrified instead of dramatic. Across the ballroom, waiters stood frozen beside untouched trays of lobster bites and champagne flutes. The orchestra members exchanged nervous glances. Even the city lights outside seemed strangely distant now. Ethan finally exhaled once. "Who are you?" Naomi blinked. The question caught her off guard. "Naomi Carter, sir." How would a waitress know anything about poison drinks? The room quieted even further. Naomi hesitated. She hated talking about the life she almost had. "I studied biochemistry before I left school." Somebody near the bar scoffed openly. "Convenient." Naomi ignored it. "Certain toxins can react differently at cold temperatures," she continued carefully. "Especially if they are sealed inside ice." Ethan stared at the glass again. For the first time since she screamed across the ballroom, uncertainty flickered across his face. Small. Brief. But real. Then another voice suddenly cut through the tension. "Ethan, this is ridiculous." A tall man stepped forward from near the center table. Gray suit. Expensive watch. Calm smile that never quite reached his eyes. Daniel Cross. Ethan's chief financial officer and closest advisor for nearly a decade. "You cannot seriously be entertaining this," Daniel said smoothly. "Tonight is too important for paranoia." Ethan glanced toward him. "Maybe." Daniel smiled faintly and reached toward the whiskey glass. "Then let us put this nonsense to rest." Naomi's stomach dropped instantly. "Wait." Her voice cracked harder this time. Daniel paused. Naomi stared directly at him now. Because suddenly she realized something even more terrifying than the drink itself. He was not nervous at all. Naomi's throat tightened as Daniel Cross rested his hand near the whiskey glass without the slightest hesitation. Not a flicker of concern crossed his face. Not curiosity. Not even annoyance. Just calm. Smooth. Controlled calm. And somehow that frightened her more than anything else in the room. "Do not touch it," she said quickly. Her voice echoed sharper than she intended. Several guests groaned under their breath. One older investor shook his head impatiently. "This has gone far enough." Another muttered, "Fire her already." Naomi heard every word, but her eyes stayed locked on Daniel. Something about him felt rehearsed. Too steady. Too polished. Like a man who had already prepared for this moment long before anyone else realized they were inside it. Daniel slowly looked toward her with a thin smile. "Miss Carter, right?" His tone sounded polite, but empty underneath. "You are making very serious accusations based on a smell and an ice cube." Naomi swallowed hard. "I know what I smelled." Daniel chuckled softly, earning nervous laughter from a few guests nearby. "You know how many people in this room have investments depending on tonight?" He gestured calmly toward the ballroom around them. "This merger affects stock markets, research labs, jobs, pensions. Billions of dollars." His eyes narrowed slightly. "And now everything is frozen because a waitress." Panicked. The word waitress landed exactly how he intended it to. Naomi felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she refused to look down. Ethan Whitmore remained silent near the cocktail table, studying both of them carefully now. The billionaire had built his empire reading people faster than spreadsheets. And something in the room no longer felt simple. Outside the towering windows, rain had started falling over Manhattan. Thin streaks sliding down glass 50 stories above the city streets. The ballroom lights reflected against the storm clouds like gold trapped underwater. Daniel finally reached for the whiskey glass again. Naomi stepped forward instinctively. "Please." The desperation in her voice surprised even her. "Do not drink it." Ethan suddenly spoke. "Nobody touches the glass." The room went still again. Daniel's hand stopped midair. Slowly, he turned toward Ethan with an expression almost too relaxed. "You cannot seriously believe this." Ethan did not answer immediately. His blue eyes shifted toward the cloudy ice sphere floating in the amber liquid. Then back to Naomi. "You said you studied biochemistry?" Naomi nodded carefully. 2 years at Hunter College before I left." "Why did you leave?" The question caught her off guard. So did the fact that he asked it in front of everyone. Naomi hesitated. "My mother got sick." The ballroom quieted further. "I had to work." Ethan looked at her for another long second. People like him usually never asked follow-up questions to people like her. But tonight, something had shifted. Tiny. Uncomfortable. Real. Daniel folded his arms now. "Ethan, with all due respect, this is becoming embarrassing." His smile tightened. "You are allowing a server to hijack your event because she watched too many crime shows." A few guests laughed nervously again. Naomi felt humiliation crawl across her skin, but she stood her ground. Because beneath the expensive perfume, the jazz music, and the glittering skyline, her instincts were screaming louder than ever. Then suddenly, one of the hotel managers rushed across the ballroom holding a silver tablet in trembling hands. His face had gone pale. "Sir," he said breathlessly to Ethan. "Security just reviewed the bar footage." The manager looked directly at Daniel. "There is something you need to see." The ballroom no longer sounded like a celebration. It sounded like people trying not to panic in expensive clothing. The hotel manager stopped beside Ethan Whitmore, breathing hard as rain tapped softly against the massive glass windows overlooking Manhattan. His hands shook slightly as he held out the tablet. "Sir," he repeated quietly, "security isolated the footage from the private bar." Ethan took the tablet without a word. Around him, conversations dissolved into nervous whispers. Naomi Carter stood frozen near the broken champagne tray, painfully aware that half the room still looked at her like she was the problem instead of the warning. Daniel Cross adjusted the sleeve of his gray suit calmly. Too calmly. "This is unnecessary," he said with a tight smile. "You are turning a misunderstanding into a public spectacle." Ethan ignored him. The billionaire's eyes stayed fixed on the screen. The ballroom lights reflected faintly across his face as the video played. Security footage. Timestamped 37 minutes earlier. The private whiskey bar near the west side balcony appeared on screen. Bartenders moved quickly beneath golden lights. Wealthy guests laughed in the background. Then the footage slowed. Naomi saw it instantly. A man wearing catering gloves approached the counter carrying a silver ice container. His face stayed hidden beneath a black mask and baseball cap, but his movements were deliberate. Focused. He opened the container beside the whiskey setup. One of the bartenders turned away for barely 3 seconds. That was all it took. The masked man swapped something inside the ice tray, then disappeared into the crowd. The footage ended. Silence swallowed the room whole. Ethan slowly lowered the tablet. Nobody laughed now. Nobody rolled their eyes anymore. Naomi could feel the atmosphere shifting around her like pressure before a storm breaks. Daniel finally spoke again, but this time his voice lacked some of its earlier confidence. Anybody could have staged that. Ethan turned toward him slowly. Staged it? Daniel spread his hands carefully. We do not even know what we are looking at. Naomi watched Ethan's face change by inches. The cold certainty he carried when the night began was cracking. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like glass under pressure. One of the investors stepped backward from the cocktail tables. Another guest immediately set down her champagne flute untouched. Fear moved through the ballroom faster than music ever could. Then a security officer approached holding a second glass. "Sir," he said carefully, "we tested residue from the melted ice." The officer hesitated before finishing. There was an abnormal chemical reaction. Several people gasped softly. Naomi felt her knees weaken with relief and terror at the same time. She had been right. God help her, she had actually been right. Ethan's jaw tightened hard enough to flex beneath the ballroom lights. "Call the police," he said quietly. The words landed like thunder. Suddenly the room exploded into movement. Phones appeared instantly. Guests whispered frantically. A woman near the orchestra began crying softly into her husband's shoulder. One of the board members demanded all exits be locked. Security guards moved quickly toward the elevators. Through all the chaos, Naomi noticed only one thing. Daniel Cross had gone completely pale. Not shocked. Not confused. Cornered. He loosened his tie slightly and forced another smile, but this one looked strained around the edges. "Ethan," he said carefully, "you cannot seriously think I had anything to do with this." Ethan stared at him for a long moment. "I have not accused you of anything." Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but stopped. Because now everyone in the ballroom was staring at him instead of Naomi. And for the first time all night, the invisible waitress was no longer the weakest person in the room. The ballroom had become a cage made of gold and fear. Nobody touched the drinks anymore. Crystal glasses sat abandoned across white linen tables while security guards quietly sealed the exits to the rooftop venue. Outside, rain streaked across the Manhattan skyline in silver lines, blurring the city lights beneath the storm. Inside, every eye remained fixed on Daniel Cross. The billionaire executives who had laughed at Naomi Carter less than 10 minutes ago were now stepping away from him one careful inch at a time. Daniel noticed it too. His polished smile faded slightly as he loosened his collar again. "This is insane," he said sharply. A blurry security clip proves nothing. Ethan Whitmore stood motionless near the cocktail table, his whiskey untouched beside him. The billionaire looked different now. Less untouchable. Less certain. The kind of man who had spent years controlling rooms was suddenly realizing he had almost lost control of his own life. "Then explain the footage," Ethan said quietly. Daniel gave a quick laugh, but nobody joined him this time. "Someone swapped ice at a crowded event. That does not mean I had anything to do with it." Naomi watched the two men carefully. Her heartbeat still had not slowed down. Part of her wanted to disappear into the kitchen and wake up from this nightmare. But another part knew she could not leave now. Not after what she had seen. One of the hotel security officers approached Ethan again holding a small sealed evidence bag. Inside was the partially melted ice sphere from the whiskey glass. Tiny cracks spread through the frozen surface like spiderwebs beneath the ballroom lights. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "lab technicians confirmed traces of cyanide compounds inside the ice." Several guests gasped openly. One woman nearly dropped her purse. Another executive backed into a table so suddenly that silverware rattled across the room. The danger was real now. No more speculation. No more nervous jokes. Somebody had tried to kill Ethan Whitmore in the middle of his own celebration. Ethan slowly closed his eyes for one brief second. When he opened them again, the room felt colder somehow. "Everyone stays until the police arrive," he ordered. Daniel stepped forward immediately. "You cannot lock down investors and board members over this." Ethan turned toward him. "Watch me." The tension between the two men tightened like a wire stretched too far. Naomi noticed something then. Daniel was sweating now despite the cool air inside the ballroom. Tiny beads near his temples. His fingers tapping once against his wrist before stopping suddenly. Fear. Real fear. And somehow Naomi knew this story was bigger than poison. Bigger than one glass of whiskey. Then her eyes drifted toward the security tablet still resting near Ethan. The paused footage remained frozen on screen. The masked man near the ice container. Black gloves. Dark baseball cap. Naomi stared harder. Something about the figure felt strangely familiar. Her stomach tightened. She stepped closer before she could stop herself. "Can you rewind it?" she asked softly. Ethan looked at her, surprised. "What?" Naomi pointed toward the screen. "The man by the bar." Daniel immediately interrupted. "This is pointless." But Ethan ignored him and handed the tablet to Naomi. Her fingers trembled slightly as she replayed the footage frame by frame. The ballroom fell silent again. Then Naomi suddenly froze. Her breath caught. Because hanging briefly from beneath the masked man's sleeve was a silver watch with a deep blue face. Elegant. Expensive. Unmistakable. Naomi had seen that watch all night long. Daniel Cross was wearing it right now. The entire ballroom seemed to inhale at once. Naomi Carter lowered the tablet slowly, her eyes fixed on the silver watch wrapped around Daniel Cross's wrist. The deep blue face reflected the chandelier light exactly the same way it had in the security footage. Elegant. Sharp. Impossible to ignore once you noticed it. "That watch," Naomi whispered. Nobody spoke. Daniel looked down instinctively for half a second before forcing a laugh that sounded painfully thin now. "You cannot be serious." Naomi stepped closer to the screen again. "Pause it there." Ethan Whitmore reached over and froze the footage at the exact frame where the masked man lifted the ice container. The silver watch glimmered beneath the black sleeve. A quiet murmur rolled through the ballroom like distant thunder. One investor slowly removed his glasses and leaned closer. Another guest pulled out a phone, comparing the image on screen to Daniel standing only a few feet away. The similarities were impossible to miss now. Daniel's smile finally disappeared completely. "Lots of people own watches like that," he snapped. But his voice cracked slightly on the last word. Ethan noticed it too. The billionaire's face had gone cold in a different way now. Not angry. Betrayed. "Take off the watch," Ethan said quietly. Daniel blinked. "What?" "Take it off." Every sound inside the ballroom vanished again. Even the rain outside seemed quieter somehow. Daniel stared at Ethan for a long moment, disbelief hardening into resentment behind his eyes. "You think I tried to kill you?" Ethan did not answer immediately. That silence hurt more than shouting ever could. Because men like Ethan Whitmore did not trust easily. And when they finally did, betrayal became personal. Naomi stood near the shattered champagne tray, watching years of loyalty collapse in real time between two powerful men. Daniel slowly removed the watch from his wrist. His hands were no longer steady. One of the security officers immediately stepped forward and sealed it inside an evidence bag. A woman near the orchestra covered her mouth. Another executive whispered, "Oh my God." Daniel looked around the ballroom and realized something terrifying. Nobody was defending him anymore. The same people who toasted him an hour ago were now inching farther away like fear was contagious. "This is insane," Daniel said again, but now the confidence was gone. "I have worked beside you for 12 years. Ethan's eyes never left him. "Then why are you sweating?" Daniel opened his mouth, but no words came out. Naomi noticed his breathing quickened slightly. Tiny things. Human things. The kind invisible people learn to notice because they spend their lives studying rooms that never study them back. Then suddenly Daniel's expression changed. Not panic. Calculation. He looked toward the ballroom exits. Security guards instantly shifted positions. Ethan saw it too. "Nobody leaves," he said sharply. Daniel laughed once under his breath. "Bitter this time. You really want the truth?" Several guests stepped backward immediately. Naomi felt tension snap through the room like a wire pulled too tight. Ethan's jaw clenched. "Start talking." Daniel looked directly at him now, years of hidden resentment boiling quietly beneath polished manners and expensive suits. "You built a company where loyalty meant obedience," he said coldly. "You pushed everyone until they broke. You just never noticed I broke first." The room froze again. Ethan stared at him without blinking. Naomi felt her stomach tighten because suddenly this was no longer only about poison. It was about power. Ego. Revenge. And the terrifying things wealthy men hide behind perfect smiles. Then red and blue lights flashed across the rain-soaked windows outside. The police had arrived. Red and blue police lights washed across the ballroom windows like waves crashing against glass. The storm outside had grown heavier now, thunder rumbling somewhere above Manhattan while officers entered the Grand Meridian Hotel through the private elevator lobby. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. The same guests who arrived laughing over million-dollar investments now stood frozen beside untouched champagne and melting ice. Fear had leveled the room. Daniel Cross stood near the center of the ballroom surrounded by security guards, but somehow he still carried himself like a man refusing to admit defeat. His gray suit remained perfectly pressed. His posture straight. Only his eyes betrayed him now. Restless. Sharp. Looking for exits that no longer existed. Ethan Whitmore faced him from across the marble floor, jaw tight beneath the chandelier light. Naomi Carter remained quietly near the edge of the room, invisible again in some ways, yet somehow more important than anyone there. One police detective approached Ethan carefully. "Mr. Whitmore, we are going to need statements from everyone involved." Ethan nodded once without taking his eyes off Daniel. "Start with him." Daniel laughed softly under his breath. "Not nervous this time. Angry." "Of course," he said bitterly. "Because now I am the villain." The detective stepped closer. "Sir, security footage places you near the contaminated ice container." Daniel's eyes darkened. Contaminated. He repeated the word like it insulted him personally. "Do you know how many nights I spent building Whitmore Biotech beside him?" He pointed toward Ethan sharply. 12 years. 12 years cleaning up his disasters, fixing his mistakes, taking calls at 3 in the morning while he smiled for magazine covers. Ethan's expression hardened immediately. "You were paid $30 million last year. And you made $3 billion. The room fell silent again. Naomi noticed several executives lowering their eyes uncomfortably. Because beneath the accusations and police lights, something uglier was surfacing. Resentment. Years of it. Daniel took a slow breath before speaking again. You know what the funny part is? He looked directly at Ethan now. I never even hated you at first. I admired you. His voice cracked slightly beneath the ballroom music still humming faintly through ceiling speakers. But eventually I realized something. Men like you do not build empires alone. You just make sure nobody remembers the people standing behind you. Ethan stared at him coldly. So you tried to murder me? No, Daniel's answer came too fast. Too sharp. The detective narrowed his eyes immediately. Daniel noticed. His shoulders dropped slightly for the first time all night. I was supposed to scare you, he admitted quietly. Several guests gasped softly. Naomi felt her stomach twist. Daniel looked down at the marble floor as rain battered the windows behind him. The dosage was never intended to kill you immediately. The plan was for you to get sick during the merger announcement. Public collapse. Stock panic. Board intervention. Ethan's face turned pale with disbelief. You wanted the board to remove me. Daniel finally looked up again. You were becoming reckless. So you poisoned me. I gave the board a reason to stop worshipping you. The words hit harder than shouting. Because they sounded honest. Dangerous, broken honesty. The detective stepped forward carefully. Sir, you are admitting involvement in tampering with the drink? Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I am admitting I was tired of being invisible. The sentence landed in Naomi's chest harder than anyone else in the room. Invisible. She understood that feeling too well. But unlike Daniel, she had never allowed bitterness to poison her soul. Ethan noticed Naomi standing silently nearby then. Their eyes met. Across the ballroom for one long moment. And for the first time that night, the billionaire looked at the waitress not as staff, not as background noise, but as the person who had saved his life from a man he trusted more than anyone. The ballroom emptied slowly after midnight. Police officers escorted Daniel Cross through the private elevator lobby while rain continued pouring over Manhattan like the city itself was trying to wash the night clean. The billion-dollar merger had been postponed indefinitely. Investors left in silence. The orchestra packed away their instruments without speaking. Broken champagne glasses still glittered across the marble floor beneath the chandeliers, tiny reminders of how quickly power can crack. Naomi Carter stood alone near the service station, folding linen napkins with trembling hands she could finally no longer control. The adrenaline had faded now, leaving only exhaustion behind. Her manager had already apologized 3 separate times for almost throwing her out earlier. Suddenly everybody wanted to be kind to her. Funny how quickly respect appears after survival becomes profitable. Naomi stared out the rain-covered windows for a moment, watching headlights blur 50 stories below. She should have gone home already. Her shift technically ended hours ago. But something inside her still felt unsettled. The night had changed too much too quickly. Miss Carter. Ethan Whitmore's voice stopped her mid-breath. Naomi turned slowly. The billionaire stood alone now without executives, photographers, or security surrounding him. Without the crowd, he somehow looked older. Less polished. The perfect armor he wore all night had cracked around the edges. His tie was loosened slightly. Rainwater still shimmered faintly on his tuxedo shoulders from where he had stepped onto the balcony earlier after the police arrived. For a second neither of them spoke. 2 people from completely different worlds standing in the same silence. Ethan finally looked down at the folded napkin in Naomi's hands. You are still working? Naomi gave a tired half-smile. Somebody has to clean up the mess. The words landed harder than she intended. Ethan noticed. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. Another silence settled between them. Softer this time. Not hostile. Just honest. Ethan glanced toward the dark ballroom behind them. I almost drank it. Naomi swallowed quietly. Yes, sir. He looked at her again. Why did you stop me? The question sounded genuine. Not performative. Naomi hesitated because the truth was complicated. She could have talked about chemistry or instinct or survival. But none of those were the real answer. Because I knew nobody else was paying attention, she said softly. Ethan's expression shifted slightly. Naomi continued before she lost the courage. People notice different things when they spend their whole lives being overlooked. The billionaire stood completely still. Those words hit him differently than accusations or police reports ever could. Because deep down, Ethan knew she was right. Men like him moved through life surrounded by people trained to impress them, flatter them, obey them. But invisible people observed everything. Every weakness. Every lie. Every crack in the room. Ethan rubbed one hand across his jaw slowly. Daniel said something earlier. Naomi looked up carefully. About being invisible. Ethan nodded once. The difference is that he let bitterness consume him. His eyes met hers directly now. You did not. Naomi looked down at the napkin in her hands again. I came close sometimes. The honesty surprised both of them. Ethan studied her quietly for several seconds. Then he asked the question Naomi never expected to hear from someone like him. What happened to medical school? Naomi blinked. Biochemistry, she corrected gently. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. My mother got sick, Naomi said quietly. Lupus. Insurance stopped covering treatment. I left school and started working full-time. Ethan lowered his eyes briefly. Somewhere in the distance thunder rolled across the city skyline again. Whitmore Biotech owns one of the largest autoimmune research divisions in the country, he said carefully. Naomi looked at him, confused. Ethan took a slow breath before speaking again. And somehow the smartest person in this ballroom tonight was carrying champagne instead of leading a laboratory. 3 months later, the internet still had not stopped talking about the night everything changed at the Grand Meridian Hotel. News clips replayed the story across every major network. Headlines called it a billionaire scandal. A corporate betrayal. A miracle. But the part people remembered most was not the poison or the police investigation. It was the footage of a black waitress standing in the middle of a room full of power and refusing to stay silent. The video had spread everywhere. Millions of views in less than 48 hours. Social media slowed down the exact moment Naomi Carter shouted across the ballroom, her voice cutting through crystal chandeliers and billionaire arrogance like lightning splitting open the sky. Comment sections filled with people saying the same thing. Nobody listened to her until it was almost too late. Whitmore Biotech never recovered completely from the scandal. The merger collapsed. Daniel Cross accepted a plea agreement tied to corporate conspiracy charges and financial manipulation. Investors resigned. Board members vanished from public view overnight. But the biggest change happened somewhere nobody expected. Inside Ethan Whitmore himself. The billionaire who once measured people by results and status had quietly disappeared from magazine covers after the incident. No interviews. No luxury conferences. No carefully rehearsed speeches about leadership. Instead, reports surfaced that Whitmore Biotech had launched a new scholarship initiative funding minority students pursuing medical research and biochemical sciences. The program carried no flashy branding. Just one sentence printed quietly beneath the foundation logo. Talent should never be invisible. Naomi saw the announcement on her phone while riding the subway downtown one rainy Tuesday morning. She stared at the screen for several seconds before shaking her head softly in disbelief. Her stop arrived outside a modern glass research building on the Upper East Side. For the first time in years, she was not wearing an apron. No trays. No name tag pinned to black fabric. Instead, Naomi walked through the front doors carrying a leather notebook and a security badge with her name printed beneath the words Research Associate. The lobby smelled like fresh coffee and sterile lab equipment instead of whiskey and polished marble. Scientists moved through the hallways discussing autoimmune trials and treatment data while rain tapped gently against the windows outside. Naomi paused briefly beside the elevator mirrors, almost unable to recognize herself anymore. Not because she suddenly became important, but because somebody had finally seen what she already was. Upstairs, Ethan Whitmore stood inside a conference room overlooking the Manhattan skyline. He no longer looked like the man from the gala. Still powerful. Still sharp. But quieter somehow. Like surviving betrayal had stripped away the performance and left only the human being underneath. He turned as Naomi entered the room. "First week going well?" he asked. Naomi smiled slightly. "Nobody has asked me to refill champagne yet." Ethan laughed softly under his breath. The sound surprised both of them. For a moment they stood there in comfortable silence, the city glowing gray beyond the windows. Then Ethan's expression grew serious again. "You know," he said carefully, "I spent most of my life believing power meant control." Naomi looked at him quietly. Ethan glanced toward the storm clouds hanging over Manhattan. "But the truth is, power means nothing if you stop seeing people." Naomi thought back to the ballroom. The broken glass. The whispers. The fear. The moment a room full of wealthy strangers looked at her like she mattered only after disaster forced them to. Then she looked down at the research badge hanging from her neck. "Sometimes," she said softly, "people only learn the value of a voice after they almost lose it forever." Ethan nodded once. No argument. No speech. Because some lessons cost too much to ignore. Outside, rain continued falling over the city while thousands of people rushed through streets below without looking at one another. But high above Manhattan, inside a quiet laboratory built on second chances, a former waitress and a billionaire CEO stood side by side not because of money, power, or status, but because one person chose courage while everyone else chose silence.